the 4 panelists join me on the stage, please? Thank you. Stay there. Oh, cool. Yeah, cool. Yes. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. My name is Yan. Welcome to the first panel of the CCLPS annual graduate conference, Decolonizing the Cultural Institution. My name is Yan. I'm a PhD student from the CCLPS, and I'm one of the organizers of the conference. So I will keep my introduction as light as possible. So as you have already noticed, the title of the first panel is Decolonial Discourses and Cultural Contexts, a Critical Overview. Basically, the panel is intended to review and reflect upon some of the most pressing issues that have been going on in recent decolonial discourses and practices. And we have 4 lovely panelists today. The first speaker will be Flair Donglai Shi. Flair is a DPhil candidate in the English department at the University of Oxford. His thesis focuses on the yellow peril as a traveling discourse in modern Anglophone and Sinophone literatures. His research interests include post-colonial and queer theories, Victorian literature, and modern East Asian literatures. So please limit your presentation to 20 minutes, and we'll have all the presentations done. Then we will take questions from the audience. Thank you. Please.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so if I don't perform my best today, please excuse me, because I was just adjusted to be the first speaker. So my title is The Failure to Decolonize the Literary Prize, and I focus on this case study about the Man Asian Literary Prize. I think maybe it ties in well with the conference in the way that, you know, we start from the kind of broad overview about world literature, and then we go to the specifics about the decolonization of SOAS, I guess, later in the day. But then when I designed this topic, I was a bit worried about the use of the word decolonize, because I think what is the meaning, I think, I want to ask, you know, by attending this conference, is that what is the meaning of saying that we're still decolonizing things out in the 21st century, whereas there were all these political movements in the Cold War era, you know, in the actual colonies, former colonies themselves, who had, you know, struggled so much to decolonize their spaces in a much more institutional way. So for me, I guess I would say that decolonization for me in terms of the cultural industry is to focus on who gets the agency to recognize whose culture, right? So I wish by the end of the representation I would succeed in pointing out some of the problematics in particular in the so-called world literature space. I situate mainly my research in the whole discussion about the literary prize as a kind of cultural institution. Starting from 2002, James English has been doing a lot of research about how cultural capital is created and circulated by this by this kind of literary prizes, and a lot of them have been done since then, like the research on the Nobel Prize, on the Booker. But then most of this research focuses on successful prizes that have continued to bring us more kind of world literature that are from outside of the West, and they seem to be doing a good job. But what I'm trying to focus on today is this one called Man Asian Literary Prize, the so-called Asian Booker. I'm not sure whether some of you have noticed it, because, you know, the books who have won this prize, they would feature this the name of this prize and the cultural capital the prize carries on the cover. But then the prize disappeared after 2013. So that's a quite interesting phenomenon for me to investigate, considering how big a name the Booker is in the UK and internationally, right? So the structure of my talk to be, I will bring a little bit of the history about the establishment, the decline, and then the defunctness of the prize, and then I offer kind of 3 reasons for its failure. And then the conclusion would be how this failure is quite indicative about the limitations of the current ways that this kind of literary prizes in the West are trying to bring world literature in. So the prize was, the genesis of the prize was in 2002 when the Hong Kong International Literary Festival got in touch with the Men Group, and then it was the first time that the Men Group started to fund the festival. And then in 2006, the festival itself changed the name to the Men Hong Kong International Literary Festival. By the way, the literary festival itself is also defunct. But at that time, at its founding moment, I guess, there was an archive at Oxford Brookes University. I went into the archive and there were some documents about when they first founded it, what are the thoughts behind it. So in the kind of documents there, they said that the idea is to link the leading English language festival in Asia to the leading kind of Man Booker Prize group, right? The Man Group sponsorship, and then to create this this prize that can serve to bring in more Asian works into the so-called world literature space. So in its kind of founding moments, it was done through this kind of chain of social capital built into the organizers. I guess the Nuri Ventacci is the founder of the Hong Kong Literary Prize, the Hong Kong Literary Festival, and then he contacted the writer, Rosemary Sayer, the Australian writer, and then the writer introduced him to the regional manager of the Man Group in Asia, Matt Dillon, and then they kind of forged this link. There's a chain of social capital going on there. But then the idea they had at the beginning is really to promote this sense of newness, the so-called that this prize has to be something new. This prize has to function as something that the current prizes do not offer. So what they said is that the idea is that this prize should be explicitly Asian, and then they defined that by confining it to a geographical area of 34 Asian countries, ranging from Turkey to Japan and all the way. And then their idea is that the newness is actually particularly just a kind of specific perspective, just new to the English-speaking peoples, the so-called English-speaking peoples in North America, Europe, and Australia, and quite Eurocentric in that way because we all know that English-speaking peoples exist outside of these spaces. So the criteria then for them is that the books that are selected should be unpublished in English, and the idea is that by giving them this prize, it would allow them to enter this space of world literature and to be published for the first time in English, and everything would be organized and packaged for them. And the idea is that it should bring in more kind of national bestsellers from the local context that are not adequately recognized in international literary space. But then, like I said, if you look at the winners and some of the shortlisted works, they are not really new at all if you are from those geographical spaces. So from the first one to the last one, because it only operated for 6 years or 7 years, all of them basically are national bestsellers. From the first one, especially the first one, Wolf Totem, it kept the position of being the bestseller in China for 3 years, from 2004 to 2006, and it was the most expensive book that was bought by Penguin, the most expensive Chinese book bought by Penguin in terms of translation rights. And then the second one also, it's from the Philippines, and it won the grand prize at the literary festival, the most important literary festival in the Philippines. So the idea is really to bring back the national. But then I guess they paid really a heavy price for bringing these books in. And then you can see that in the founding documents, there are 3 kind of explicitly interventionist agenda that they had. So the first one is that they really emphasize this need to recognize this rising Asia. Rather than keeping Asia in this kind of so-called post-colonial Asian literature space in the West, they want to broaden the definition of Asia. They want to kind of circumvent the post-colonial, the so-called post-colonial, because they think that the post-colonial Asian literature done by diasporic writers have kind of monopolized the representation of Asia in the West, and then they want to go back to the national context themselves to recognize the rising Asia. And then they are unsatisfied in the sense that with the idea of circumventing the national, because that's how conventionally the literary prizes are done. According to a lot of research, most notably James English, it is an established rule that to be international means that you are super local, which means that you are not really national, especially in cases where there are political differences between the so-called international and national. For example, in China, most explicitly, that being world literature sometimes means that you're just banned in China. And this is what they try to challenge. They don't want to keep doing this because this is such an old paradigm. You want to, always foreground those banned works. You want to foreground controversial writers that are not probably welcomed at their national spaces. So they tried to challenge it. And if you look at the complete long lists and short lists, except Yan Lianke's Dream of Dean Village, all the other works are nationally successful or nationally accepted, at least, right? None of them were banned. So that's their kind of operating strategy. But then there was a significant rule change in 2010. I suppose the main reason is because after the first 2 years, they paid a lot of money for these books to be brought into the Western markets, but then they did not sell as well, and the symbolic capital of the prize did not accumulate fast enough. So they tried to kind of increase its economic capital. So they increased the price from 10,000 to 30,000 US dollars. And then they changed the rule from works unpublished in English to works written or translated into English that have already been published. And then this is very significant because if you think about the rules of literary prizes, like James English has defined, to bring in a new prize, the important thing is to differentiate yourself from the other more established prizes. Otherwise, you don't really occupy a unique kind of niche in the markets, right? So, but then by doing this, by saying that, okay, we will recognize the works that already been published or even written in English, then it creates a significant overlap with the post-colonial, the so-called Anglophone post-colonial. For example, the books also would qualify for the Man Booker International or even Nobel Prize in Literature. So the prize itself, it's starting to lose its unique kind of niche. And then by doing this, I think they were trying to bring in more journalistic capital in the sense that they can bring in the big names to say, like, okay, like we have these Asian writers, and then these writers are in competition within this prize, so that the prize can be more talked about in journalism or in the wider academic sphere. So, for example, they in the short list that came after the rule change, you can recognize some very prominent names like Nobel literature winners like Kenzaburo and Orhan Pamuk, and very established post-colonial writers like Amitav Ghosh and Roy and Haruki Murakami. Is always in all these literary prizes, right? So what happens then is that you would see it did bring in a lot of journalistic capital for the prize because you can observe that the Guardian and then the New York Times, they would have headlines like, Kenzaburo Oe leads this year's Man Asian Booker Prize shortlist. But then what this undermines is that the symbolic capital of the literary prize itself is overwhelmed by the symbolic capital of the authors themselves. So people's attention is always focused on the author rather than the prize. For example, this is quite funny that at the last year of its operation, the overlap kind of created this dilemma not a dilemma, maybe a little bit of a scandal to show that how this prize has failed to accumulate the symbolic capital. That year, the Indian poet Jeet Thayil, I'm sorry about my pronunciation, and then the Malaysian novelist Tan Tuan En, they were both shortlisted by the Man Booker International for the same books. But then they didn't really win the Man Booker International, and then because the announcement of the Asian Booker comes later than the Man Booker International, so after their kind of failure to win the Man Booker, they lost it to, I think, Mantel, yeah. And the official website of the Booker publicized this statement saying that there's a second chance for Jeet and Tan Tuan En. And they say that this would be a chance at overcoming the disappointment of missing out on the Man Booker by winning its subcontinental cousin. So you can see that by framing it this way, that the Man Booker really became the so-called Asian Booker. You put like a label up ahead of it, and then it's an inferior thing that you maybe can win because you have lost the Booker, right? But then it's quite funny because after he won the last Man Booker, at that time, of course, it was not publicized that actually it was running out of funding and they couldn't really fund new sponsorship. But then when he won the prize, of course, because when authors, they win prizes, they're already part of the cultural institution, their symbolic capital and their literary capitals are already intertwined with the prize, and then they would, of course, say things nice about the prize. But so he actually quite ironically from, retrospectively, he said that I'm sure this particular prize will evolve and become an even greater force in the years to come. But then, in fact, that he became the last one to win the prize. So by looking at those archival materials, I came out with kind of 3 reasons about why this prize failed, and I think it's quite indicative about the limitations of the so-called world literature debate that we have, and about how still we have to overcome this Eurocentrism in the so-called recognition game for literary works from elsewhere. Maybe the same applies to other cultural products, I'm not sure. The first one is quite common sense, is the lack of scandalous currency. This is not particularly about the world literature structures, but then it is quite indicative because if you compare the history of the Man Booker, the Asian Booker to the Man Booker, you can see there were much less scandals about it. For example, I think in the 1980s when J.M. Cassier first won the Man Booker, Salman Rushdie was kind of very angry, and then there was a lot of scandals about what he did over the dinner and stuff. But then what the Asian Booker people did, especially the judges, they were trying explicitly to kind of tone down all the kind of controversial possibilities about the prize. So when they were asked about, okay, you changed that rule, like does that mean that you will be overwhelmed by those prominent authors and you will probably give them priorities? But then they kind of always gave this kind of standard answers to these journalistic questions so that they did not really strike enough interest in the in the market, so-called. And then the second one, also very important, is that even though their goal is to say, okay, we are going to bring in more nationally recognized works that are not enough recognized in the international literary space, but then they don't engage with the Asian countries themselves. Especially when the Asian countries probably would be very happy to accumulate some kind of soft power for themselves to promote these literary works that are finally not banned or not condemned, right? But then they didn't really engage with those countries. Especially when you compare it to the Cervantes Prize in Spain. This prize was established in Spain after the Franco years and to recognize Latin American works. It's kind of a post-colonial, but in a sense that the Spanish king served as the kind of symbol for the Spanish-speaking sphere, but more importantly, that it's a collaboration between these countries, and then those Latin American countries were also very happy to be recognized by this kind of authority. But then also they offered the sense of democracy to this kind of post-Franco Spain. So both parties gain a lot in this kind of interaction. So I think a similar thing did not happen for the Asian Booker. Even though if they did it, they probably would be condemned by the press saying that, okay, they're collaborating with the authoritarian powers in Asia, but then that would further maybe create more scandalous currency for them. So who knows? And then the most important one, I think, is that they did not really serve to break away from the dominating structures that are current in world literature. For example, even though they say, okay, we're going to move on to recognize this national literature that are kind of always circumvented in the international literary space, but then what they do is still quite conventional in terms of the kind of literature that they recognize. And this is especially very true in their selection of works from China, for example, especially considering 3 of the 6 winners are Chinese, but then all of them about the Cultural Revolution, and then Cultural Revolution is such an established trope in Western literatures about China, or literatures available in the West about China. And then they are all translated by Howard Goldblatt. It's like the god of Chinese translation. So this really doesn't really break away from the conventional paradigm in that sense. They did not really bring in that, like the fresh voices, maybe science fiction, maybe crime fiction that are different from Western established imaginations about authoritarian China, right? And then the third thing about circumventing, because at the beginning, like I mentioned, they wanted to break away from this post-colonial diasporic representation for Asia. But if you look at their judge, except the three maybe Indian judges, all of them, they are diaspora. So basically you have a structure of Western diasporic Asian writers recognizing Asian writers from Asia. And I don't know how you can frame it as colonial, but then there's a certain hierarchy created, between the local, the diaspora, and then the Western center. And then the diaspora serves again as this colonial, maybe comprador class that works for the center to recognize the local, right? So the whole problem about this coloniality, I guess, the persist coloniality in the price is that in the world cultural economy, the West still seems to be at the center of recognition, and then it still continues to serve as the agent of recognition. And my question, I guess, is that how do we actually imagine a decolonized world literature that probably one day, if you dare imagine that like a literary prize in Asia would serve to recognize a most important piece of Western literature, and then the Western literature would be, but for now I think it's pretty unimaginable. And just as an anecdote, because the Han Gan's The Vegetarian won the Man Booker International, after the Man Booker International itself had a rule change, saying that, okay, we're gonna broaden it out to any works translated into English rather than focusing on the Commonwealth. So, but the first year after the rule change, of course, it was not surprising to me that they gave the prize to a book from East Asia, because that's conventionally different from the Commonwealth. But then I think without the failure of the Man Asian Literary Prize, probably Han Gan would never have won the Man Booker International. So I think, but then the Man Booker Asian International, I just want to ask, how different is it from the Asian Booker, and then how does this serve to open up the cultural institution that is the Booker? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation and very good timekeeping. So may I welcome Denise